SAIIA and the Center for Human Rights at Pretoria University have started this project called Global Economic Governance Africa. And when we talk about global economic governance, we talk about the G20. What is it this project aims to do by looking at G20 processes specifically?
The project aims on two levels really to address G20 issues. One is to work in the South African context. South Africa is a member of the G20, the only African country that belongs to the group. And so it's important for South African stakeholders broadly, including the government, business, civil society, labour and researchers, to have a good, strong understanding of the processes of the group so that we can make the most of our membership. We need to look at the agenda, identify what should be the priority issues from a South African point of view, and how can we all contribute to taking those forward. So I think the project aims to bring together the key players who have an interest in the issues on the G20 agenda, to provide a platform for sharing of information in particular amongst the different actors, to support in some ways the South African delegation to the G20 with focused analysis and research that is useful on certain topics. And then of course there's also a link to the second part of the project, which is to focus more broadly on increasing discussion around global issues on the African continent. And this is really starting from quite a low base when it comes from the G20, because we haven't had African countries, apart from South Africa, being part of the group. There isn't that necessary sort of day-to-day engagement on the matters in other African countries. So we're really starting from a point of creating communities of knowledge that can explore what are African interests in some of the issues, such as financial regulation, for example, or food security, and what are the ways that we can use the processes to make those voices from Africa heard.
As the only African nation in the G20, South Africa has a big responsibility to represent African views and interests, even though it's not mandated to do so. How would you explain South Africa's role in the G20 at present?
First and foremost, South Africa is in the G20 in its own right. And it's not one of the largest 20 economies in the world, so it's a slight misnomer in terms of that presentation of the G20, but it is one of the most sophisticated in terms of financial services involvement and participation in the globe, and that is really where the group of 20 came from. It came from a finances background. So South Africa is there legitimately in its own right, and its first role, I would suggest, is to represent national interests. There is the challenge of there being no other African voices formally around the table of the G20 at all times. And so I think South Africa does feel a sense of obligation to, where it can, present the views from the continent more broadly, and certainly raise appropriate interventions in line with, for example, African Union statements, the positions of the C10 finance ministers and Reserve Bank governors from African countries, and the points of view from, for example, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. So where there have been continental initiatives and there are continental plans of action on issues that are relevant for the G20, South Africa would put those forward and does so.
This would be a very difficult balance to strike for South Africa.
It's a very difficult line for South Africa to walk, however, because as you noted, South Africa is not mandated to represent the continent. It doesn't have official processes to go out and get input from all other African countries. But we, through our platform of the Global Economic Governance Africa Network, are attempting to do that in a more informal fashion by building up these African communities of knowledge on global issues.
Now, depending on who you speak to, the words the politics of consensus usually come up when you're talking about multilateral forums. How do you see the G20 in terms of facilitating consensus within other multilateral forums, of course speaking about the World Trade Organization specifically?
Definitely. The reality is that the larger multilateral spaces of the United Nations, for example, or the World Trade Organization, which has seen membership grow rapidly over the last few years, are experiencing challenges of consensus decision making, and particularly when it comes to creating binding agreements, which is the real issue in the World Trade Organization space. And I think that small group group dynamics, coalitions, the power of clubs such as the G20 is a critical part of the diplomacy of multilateral organisations. The G20 has shown particular success, if you like, in this regard, in being a catalyst in the financial space, where you've seen the Financial Stability Board, for example, taking on a lot of what comes out of the G20 in the regulatory environment. You've also seen interesting relationships between the G20 and multilateral organisations such as the World Bank, where the World Bank agenda is often discussed in the G20 space, where the World Bank also provides support for G20 discussions that reflect the views of that broader membership of the bank. The OECD is another organisation that has very close ties to the G20, and we are seeing interesting progress being made there at the moment around the transparency agenda and ensuring reform of taxation systems. These are just examples, I think, of where you've seen linkages between the G20 and multilateral processes.
How does South Africa's membership of the BRICS factor into its G20 membership?
I think it's becoming more relevant. What we're seeing is that in the margins of many G20 meetings, the BRICS is now coming together as a forum to caucus around particular topics on the agenda. The BRICS has actually shown quite a lot of success so far in cooperation on issues that are of relevance to the G20 debates, such as, for example, financial systems reform, as well as financial stability mechanisms like currency reserve arrangements. And so we are seeing regular interactions happening between BRICS countries in the margins of G20 discussions. There have been a number of official statements that has occurred in the trade space, where you've had BRICS plus a number of the other emerging economies come together and make a common position for debate in the G20. I think that we'll see this happening on an increasing level as we go forward, and certainly as the BRICS in particular finds more strength in its common vision.
And what of the criticism that the G20 agenda is often overshadowed by the G7 agenda, for example?
I think that is a valid criticism to a certain extent. You do see considerable overlaps between the issues pursued by the G7, G8 grouping with the G20. And one of the points that is made by participants, certainly in the outreach processes of the G20, is that it's very Eurocentric often in terms of the discussions that are put forward on the agenda of the broader group, and that the G7 does have significant influence over the G20. I think that that's where BRICS could potentially play a much greater role in terms of providing an alternative coalition force that could direct the agenda of the G20 in favour of developing countries.
Thank you, Catherine.